Hi. If we've not met before, I'm Quinn and I'm autistic. When I got my autism diagnosis over 40 years ago, there was nobody to ask about it outside of medical people, and not many of those knew much about it in the early days. The one thing they were all certain about, though, was that it's very definitely a medical condition and a disability. Then, in the mid 1990s, I started to hear about a new idea called neurodiversity. It was a new way of understanding not only autism, but a bunch of other similar differences in a new context. I already knew that being autistic was a mixed bag of ups and downs, and neurodiversity acknowledged that and told me I wasn't disabled after all. But what if neither of those views is right? What if there's another way of looking at autism as neither disability nor random chance? One that not only gives it a plausible and believable context, but actually makes sense to autistic people too. What if autism has a purpose? It's difficult for some people to see autism as anything other than a burden on themselves or on society as a whole. I know. I felt like that myself for quite a while, and I've chatted with plenty of folks who still do. Some watching out there will take one look at me and think, he's one of the lucky ones, compared to what they think autism should look like, and a few of those just won't be able to keep themselves from telling me so. They're usually quite surprised when I agree with them, though, albeit rarely for any of the reasons they had in mind. Whilst there's plenty of public and political hoo-ha about what causes it and how to address it, the majority of folks base their ideas of what autism is on the medical view. To the medical establishment, autism is a concept that's precise enough to diagnose but sufficiently vague to allow all sorts of uncertain theories and solutions to coexist. That makes it prime psychiatric real estate, ripe for developing by enterprising private medical concerns. But whichever direction medicine approaches it from, autism is always a disability. End of. Individual doctors do sometimes have a more constructive view, but to the monolith of modern medical orthodoxy, autism presents both a thorny intellectual challenge and a lucrative revenue stream. To the neurodiversity advocate, autism is a natural variance in the human genome, a stitch in the tapestry of life. We're all equal players in the balancing act of evolution as much as every other human born on this spinning ball of rock we call home. In neurodiversity terms, autism is an inevitable quirk of fate and family that's a testament to the incredible variety and potential of nature. It's not a disability. It's an alternative set of strengths and weaknesses that set us apart from others, but also offer us different potentials in life if given suitable conditions to thrive. If you're ever in the mood to watch those two viewpoints battle it out in public for free, then just open up your social media platform of choice, search for autism and enter the Doom Scroll Dome. I first learned that I'm autistic over 40 years ago, so I've seen autism from the inside for a long time. Back then, there was very little explanation for my diagnosis and bugger all support to speak of, so I had to find my own way forward. Decades of mapping out what went on in my head every time I did something typically autistic revealed over and again that behind all my stereotypical autistic behaviours lay one of two driving factors: fear or shame. When I got told off for being autistic in some way, it was when I was either reacting to or trying to prevent something which was horrible for me to experience. As hard as I tried, I couldn't get that through to anyone else, though. My questions, confusion, and distress were routinely dismissed as random, inappropriate, or worrying about nothing. I got very familiar with being ignored, and then watching helpless as my fears were one by one made real behind my silent screams. And that's a pattern I would end up seeing repeated over and again the more autists I talk to. Even folks who only found out they're autistic relatively recently still have similar tales to tell of their fears or concerns constantly being steamrolled and their basic needs ignored. Some of us don't scream silently, though. Some of us struggle very openly, loudly, even destructively, because we can't turn our defense mechanisms off. Often, there'll be other co-occurring conditions or intellectual disabilities that make it even harder to connect through the static of overstimulation and crazy contradiction. Our stress quickly mounts up into symptoms that scare our parents and attract the attention of doctors, whilst we're trapped in a world that won't stay still long enough for us to make sense of the rules, let alone follow them. The rest of us, the silently screaming lucky ones like me, we just spend the rest of our lives trying to work those rules out, and this video is where my efforts brought me. I hope you find something useful here. When the only tool you know is a hammer, every problem becomes a nail. It was inevitable that at some point doctors would codify the differences between autistic and non-autistic people as a deficiency with a name and a diagnostic criteria. There were actually 2 attempts to make autism a medical thing before Leo Kanner claimed it in the 1940s. Russian Grunya Sukareva and fellow Austrian Hans Asperger both worked on making autism their career-defining moment in Europe before Kanner moved to America and got his version published there. Ever since then, the medical establishment has curated the official view of autism as a personal disability, a drain on family cohesion, and a burden on society as a whole. Neurodiversity is an organic, public domain vibe in some respects, but it was a sociologist, Judy Singer, who put flesh on the bones of the idea and launched the public discussion in the 1990s, just as autism was catching public attention. Neurodiversity frames autism as one of many immutable differences of thought that arise from the natural plasticity of the human genome, rather than a problem needing a solution. It gave us words like neurodivergent and neurotypical to differentiate between people with different kinds of brain wiring. In neurodiversity terms, there's no one-size-fits-all model for human thought, and variations are essential to keep the engines of progress running. It's as much a sociologist's view of autism as our previous view was that of a doctor. But what if an anthropologist had got there first, instead of a medical doctor? What if we looked at autism in terms of human development, not from infant to adult, but the epic survival story of humanity from upstart apes to globe-spanning civilizations? When we stand back to admire the canvas of human history, the structures and technologies that we've built up into a world-spanning collection of competing economies and ways of life, which of those brushstrokes were painted by autistic folks? What roles did we play through history, and how would those roles translate into the here and now? I'm not an anthropologist. I'm an ordinary, uneducated nobody with nothing more fancy than an O-level to my name. I barely survived my stint in formal education, mainly because my autistic traits were completely incompatible with the 1980s UK education system, which put the kibosh on me pursuing most of the career paths I now know might have suited me. But in all the decades I've had to wallow in regret since, I've never once wished that I wasn't autistic. And that applies to most of the autists I speak to. Yes, there are some of us that would wish their autism away if they could. I've met quite a few to talk to over the years, and you'll see comments pop up in my posts now and again. When I've had the opportunity to have a good chat with someone who feels that way, I can usually relate to their reasons for feeling so lost, hopeless, or angry. I empathise with their motivations and their sense of loss at a lifetime of thwarted efforts to be understood, but I don't share their viewpoint in the here and now. It's not my place to challenge their feelings or their reasons. I'm not here to convert people, just offer a perspective I don't see elsewhere. I haven't lived their lives or felt their pain, so it's not my place to convince them otherwise. I talk about my own experience and what I feel I learned from it, and anyone else is free to agree, disagree, or reserve their judgment based on theirs. I do have to burst one bubble, though, for some of you at least. If you're worried that they hand out autism diagnoses willy-nilly these days, I can put your mind at rest now. That's never actually been true. I've been hearing it for at least 20 years, but if anything, it's got harder, for adults at least. For most folks, it's a long, heart-rending process that can take from months to years to complete. You just can't get an autism diagnosis unless you convince the doctor judging you that autism is holding you back in life. It's an essential qualifier. Getting the diagnosis is conditional on our autistic traits causing us misery, pain, inconvenience, or a swampy mix of all three. When I got mine, I was having troubles at school. That's how long ago it was. There are exceptions to this, as with every rule, but most diagnosticians still insist that we demonstrate clearly to them that we're both unhappy and practically disadvantaged by our autistic traits, or we're unlikely to get that piece of paper. Sorry. Yeah, okay. I installed an autistic Veracity alarm. It tells me when I'm not living up to autistic standards of truth, so I need to be a bit clearer about what I just said. Adults are one thing, but when we get our diagnoses as kids, like I did, we're not the ones complaining about any misery or inconvenience, so it's not us seeking to prove it. That'll be our parents or our teachers who usually raise those flags. We're just kids trying to be kids, and often haven't got a clue that there's something different about us until mum, dad, or someone at school suggests taking us to get checked over. We get taken into a bright room and given a Rubik's Cube to fiddle with, whilst mum goes next door and sits wringing her hands whilst nodding intently at a stranger with a notepad. And it all starts from there. Of course, that doesn't happen when we seek diagnoses as adults. Hang on, I haven't finished. Can we... Thank you. That doesn't happen when we seek diagnoses as adults as often. But it's still pretty standard. They generally don't bypass our consent like with kids, but double-checking our stories with other people is still par for the course, whatever our age. They'll ask any living parents, siblings, partners, even bosses or our kids on occasion to get them to corroborate our stories, to give their take on things. Interviewing us about our own lives and our own difficulties isn't enough until they get input from someone who knows us well enough to confirm that we really are a proper pain in the arse. Imagine that. Going to the doctor and complaining of, I don't know, say feeling depressed or anxious. Doctor, I've been feeling really low lately. I struggle to get out of bed in the morning. My motivation's all gone. I'm sad all the time. And now it's affecting my work and my relationships. I'm desperate. I don't know what to do.
No, I see. Well, everything you've told me so far leads me towards a diagnosis of clinical depression. But I'd like to ask for a second opinion. Is your mum in, or your cousin Dave? It's standard procedure to check in with your relatives to see if you really are as sad as you say you are.
When I was told I'm autistic in the 1980s, when there was no internet and the special kind of autism I had was still a theory waiting to be confirmed, I looked to whatever resources I could lay my hands on to help make sense of what I'd been told made me different to other folks. I started with my mum's bookshelf, which was stuffed with books on social history and anthropology. My mum had her own special interests, you see. Maybe those early insights into how different kinds of people, including potentially people like me, might fit into the bigger picture influenced the way I grew up to perceive my own autism. Free of the direct influence of the medical view, no course curriculum to give me direction, just my own untrained autistic enthusiasm to find out what it was that made me and the rest of the world hum at different frequencies. The neurodiversity people tell me my autism is a series of immutable neurological qualities which influence the way I perceive and interact with the world, and which vary from the commonly accepted social norms. That makes sense to me. But I also see how my flavour of autism can be a disability in the world of today because I've lived that life. My current life as a mid-50s autistic male living in 21st century England is more complicated in many ways than it might be if I weren't autistic. So in that respect, I have to concede some ground to the medics too. There is something disabling about being autistic in the world I live in. Being autistic can be inconvenient in more situations than I'd like, and I prefer to not be put out in those ways. But I'm not blaming autism or hating on the whole world for not caring enough. I know that each of my autistic weaknesses is the flip side of a strength. All those sensitivities and traits can save my skin in the right circumstances and have done over and again, so I can never see my autism as being objectively a bad thing, because I experience the upside too. In a way, I guess that means I sympathise to some degree with the medics, but we're definitely a long way from being on the same page. I'm much closer to the typical neurodiversity viewpoint, but I'm not quite on the same wavelength as that either. I do see our divergences as being entirely natural, normal, what it's worth, and hereditary, but I don't see them as just a part of the mix. I think most of these autistic traits of mine that people haven't tired of reminding me about my whole life are coping mechanisms for specific sensitivities that not everyone shares. Sensitivities that are, in varying degrees, present in all of us in this autistic category. Like any of us, I can only ever speak with true authority about myself. But if I'm right, then autism is not an aberration. It's still here because it's useful, even if it doesn't feel like it a lot of the time. It doesn't matter whether we evolved to where we are today through nature and blind chance, or we were created wholly in the image of the divine. These traits only exist in such huge numbers now because they served a worthwhile purpose historically. There was something in these human qualities that offered us a survival advantage, and that's why we're still here. It doesn't take much effort to see how many of the autism traits that make our lives difficult and frustrate the non-autistic people we interact with now wouldn't always have been as problematic. Maybe not even problems at all. It's about the halfway point, and the timer that just popped up means that this is my 30 seconds to bore you with my pleas for you to show me a bit of support. Just subscribing and hitting the notification bell, not to mention commenting on the video and sharing my work with your friends elsewhere, helps loads. But if you want to help me keep a roof over my head so I can keep making these videos, I can accept one-off super thanks on YouTube, a donation on Ko-fi, or you could sign up to Patreon to make ours an ongoing relationship. Links for all of those are below. My work on autism is my only income now, so you all make a big difference to both my future and the work I'm doing. Now, back to the main course. Whilst the world we lived in, say, 2,000 years ago, was very different to this one, humanity was exactly the same. We're a bit taller and live longer now, but if you took away man-made improvements like better nutrition and medicine, we'd be the same people biologically as we were when Romans were stomping across half the world in sandals. Our anatomy hasn't measurably changed in all the time we think of as recorded history, in fact. Go back 10,000 years and swipe an infant from a European cave and clean it up a bit, and you could swap it out with a newborn in an American hospital today without anybody knowing the difference. Modern humans, just like you and I, were making stone tools, hunting, gathering, and sheltering from the elements for hundreds of thousands of years before the first farmers planted seeds. In evolutionary terms, we haven't had time, not reproduced enough generations for meaningful change to our genome since then. If autism didn't serve a useful purpose then, our autistic traits would have disappeared long before then. Natural selection would have seen to it long before our ancestors got together to share resources, make fire, and live in caves, let alone still be part of us now. Autistic and other neurodivergent people might even have been vital to our species' survival. We've been there playing our part and contributing to the mix since the year dot. We're an old potential, baked into the template of all our genomes that will survive even the most brutal eugenicists and fundamentalists. We're here to stay, folks. Unlike the proverbial bad pennies, we'll keep popping back through random chance because that's just how life works. Autistic or not, every one of us is mentally and physically adapted to a world that doesn't exist anymore. The world has changed faster than nature can keep up, and the evidence for it is all around us. Even if we look no further than our health, how many of us have allergies to one thing or another, especially synthetic materials or cheap metals, latex allergies, and medicines that cause the same symptoms we seek to cure? Then we spend billions every year on headache tablets, indigestion remedies, and meds to speed up our toileting today and then slow it down tomorrow, whilst half of us are huffing on inhalers to help us breathe the polluted air. Even those of us who have the luxury of enough food to eat still take nutritional supplements because our processed diets can't meet our body's needs, and vitamin D so our bones don't go soft from not enough time in the sun. Then there's the oft-reported explosion in mental health diagnoses, the ubiquity of antidepressants, the loneliness epidemic, and the mounting number of online remote therapists reminding us constantly that our fragile brains can't keep up the pace. That's for those of us who don't console ourselves at the bottom of a bottle, by gambling our woes away, seeking solace in chemicals, or giving up all hope and self-exiting. Autistic people have been struggling under an overwhelming load of information, emotional stimulus, and contradictory motivations all our lives because we're built with sensitivities that once protected us, but also work against us in the world we live in today. Now, everybody's feeling a little bit of the pain we've always known because the overload is getting too much for their sensitivities too, not just us autistic canaries in the coal mine of the great social experiment. I'm not advocating for demolishing the world we've built or turning our backs on progress, but I do think we're daft if we fail to acknowledge that for all the personal benefits of modern life, technology and connection, there's plenty of downsides to the 21st century too. One way or another, we all pay a hefty price for living now. There are few of us who aren't exposed to significant harm in some way just as a consequence of living when and where we do. When we finally check out, less of us will die of natural causes than through the accidents, the cancers, the failed hearts, poisoned livers, collapsed kidneys, and demented minds we brought upon ourselves with our own choices. So, where do us autists fit into this bizarre new world? If it was our canary qualities that singled us out as special enough that we've been deemed worthy of our own label for nigh on a century, what can we do to make sense of it all, now the world's the craziest it's ever been? For me, it's been learning how to isolate and balance the things that cause me the most pain and confusion. On the road to my diagnosis, the psychologist who did most of the work explored with me how some of my character traits, his words, how some of my character traits could be seen in both a positive and a negative light, depending on who was looking. Like my uncompromising candour and honesty, for instance. Brilliant, admirable trait 99% of the time. Makes me especially trustworthy and reliable. Except when people wanted to trust me to keep their secrets. They're not so good, and so on and so on. Ever since, I've always looked at my autistic traits through a similar prism, splitting the ray of information into its constituent colours. If something autistic about me causes me friction with other folks, I don't just look at the difficulty I'm in there and then. I search for what purpose those traits might serve to our benefit in a simpler, less competitive environment, like those our brains and bodies originally took shape in. Eventually, I saw patterns emerging in all those moments when I was told my autism was letting me down. I came to realise that every autistic trait that caused me difficulty in company, which was all of them, are directly connected to my sensitivity in 3 key areas. Obviously, my emotions were out of sync with everyone else because I was constantly reminded of it. I'd also worked out that some of my senses weren't tuned to the same wavelength as others, though I was a long way from fully comprehending by how much. And that almost all the verbal foobarrs I found myself in came about because I seemed to need more information than others to make decisions. After decades of picking up new perspectives from this source and that, asking awkward questions of hundreds of autists and thousands of regular folks, and spending far too much of my spare time reading very, very boring academic papers, I finally put it all together in the autistic triad of distinction. Every one of the psychological differences between autistic folks and neurotypical people, at least the ones I know about, can be related to the way we experience and express our feelings, how we receive and process nonverbal information, and how easy or difficult it is for us to make snap decisions. Or emotions, senses, and veracity. Our highly sensitive affective emotions and overworked cognitive processing of our own feelings alters the speed and depth of our emotional output, and in the process heightens our cautionary responses. It puts us on an emotional edge, if you like. Everybody else seems to process differently to us, so we often need to ask people to clarify their motivations or tell us what their desired outcomes are before they make sense to us, which really fails to wind them up. But it also makes us far more likely to spot someone with ill intent, to see through flim-flam, and to be loyal to people we know we can trust. When the medics try to interpret our complex emotional landscapes, they described it in terms like delayed development, emotional precocity, pathological demand avoidance, poor mood regulation, and cite it amongst our communication barriers. Our elbows go up when we encounter inconsistency and hypocrisy, the same sensitivities that make so many of us great at pattern recognition, but also make life difficult in a world which prizes economy of truth. We're often sticklers for completeness and procedure, keen to ask questions before we make decisions, but also oblivious when we've bored someone to tears with our special interest. I call that a heightened sense of veracity, something I talked about a bit more detail last time and linked above. The psychiatrists call it black and white thinking, restricted interests, strict routine, and again, it's a large contributor to miscommunication. As for sensory differences, anyone who can't see the advantage of heightened senses in a threatening environment really isn't thinking about the problem clearly. If you were the first of your tribe to spot a dot moving in the distance, hear the faint snap of a twig, or smell the blood-soaked sweat of a downwind predator, you'd be the saver of everyone you knew. Or you could decide to be the hunter and use those sensory skills to help you all keep fed. Not all autistic senses are more sensitive than the average. Many of us have reduced sensitivities too, often in interoceptive sensations, our biological feedback system. I know from experience that taking longer to feel the discomfort of pain or hunger is troublesome in the present day, but in a time of crisis, those few extra hours of clarity free from the distraction of either might have allowed me to crawl the extra mile to safety that others couldn't. I could go on for a long time about how autistic traits are likely to be, in my opinion, expressions of survival traits made problematic by the worlds we now live in and the standards we've chosen to live by. I kind of started doing so a while ago when I uploaded the first 3 parts of a series I'll be working on for years to come, explaining the autistic triad of distinction. How I Made Autism Make Sense, it's called. I'll link the playlist above and in the description if you're interested. For now, whatever you thought of autism at the start of this, I'm not asking you to change your mind about it overnight, but I hope you'll allow this idea, this interpretation of autism's place in the world, to float around your bonce for a while and see what it sticks to. Maybe nothing, but please give it a chance to settle. Try it on for size and put it back on the rack if it doesn't fit. If you happen to be autistic yourself, next time you start to feel autistically uncomfortable or the wheels of the meltdown train start spinning up, try to take note of what's causing it, what you're feeling, what you're afraid of. If you can't clamp it down in the moment, you're not alone. I get that too. It's called alexithymia, and I've done several videos on it. Again, I'll link them up there. I don't always get it in the moment myself, but I get plenty of time to work it out when I relive those moments over and over again on sleepless nights. So, like I do, try to remember what was bugging you when you got so close to the edge. What was stressing you out or making you want to flee? Was it your feelings overwhelming you? Were your senses full of static? Was your brain struggling to cope with contradictions it couldn't clarify? Bit of all 3? If your discomfort, your pain, or your near meltdown or shutdown made you want to fight your way out, to run away as far as possible, or beg, plead, and fawn your way out of trouble, then you were deep in fight or flight territory. Maybe that autistic stress you felt that was nudging you towards the edge of a catastrophic stress event was actually your natural defense mechanisms trying to protect you. In which case, I could be right, and you ought to give this triad of distinction thing a closer look. Either way, I'll be back soon with more on the triad when I explain how emotional stress isn't necessarily what you think it is either. I'm Quinn, and I'm autistic. Thank you for watching.